Hello and welcome again. In my last talk, I asked you the question, what is a church? And if you remember, I suggested at the end that you might even like to think about designing your own ideal church. Now today I want to move on from that and ask you, what would you name your church? You might like to stop now and think, what would a good name be for a church? All churches have names. If you travel around England, or in fact around the whole world, you'll find that many churches, hundreds and thousands of them, are named after saints. Would you want to name your church after a saint? In Long Ashton, our parish church is called All Saints. But I think if you're doing something as important as giving a church a name, you want to make sure you've chosen a good one. So how do we find out about saints? Well, I have a book here, The Golden Legend, which was written in Latin 800 years ago. You can see the size of it. It already has many stories of many saints. Now have a look at this painting from about 600 years ago. It's full of saints as well. How can you tell they're saints? And have a look, they've all got golden halos. In a lot of the old church paintings, you can recognize saints with the fact that they're wearing golden halos. Different parts of the Christian church have different ways of deciding who will become saints. In the Church of England, there's a list of holy days in a church calendar, and there are rules for selecting saints and heroes. Saints from Bible stories, you need to stick to the Bible story. For newer saints, don't go overboard. Make sure you check that their character and their devotion to God is clear. They need to stand the test of time. Don't be too quick to choose them. And different countries are allowed to choose their own local saints. There's no difference between saints and what are called Christian heroes. They're all listed together in the church calendar. Have a look at it. Here it is. The list of Church of England saints and heroes for this time of year. If you'd like, you might like to take a look at the entire list. I was surprised to see who I found there. And there's some people I certainly want to find out more about. Some are quite modern. There are people there who are Roman Catholics and Quakers. They're not all members of the Church of England. There's one name who won't surprise you, and that's Mary, the mother of Jesus. One of the things that makes a saint is that the person is somebody who has said yes to God. And here in this very old painting, the angel has come to Mary to speak to her and tell her that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. Look at her expression. She's unsure. She's afraid. She's reluctant. Saying yes is not easy. But Mary did say yes. She said she would be the mother of Jesus. Let it be according to your word, she said. Mary said yes. Now it's time to test it out, and we're going to try a game show to do it. There's going to be a list of possible saints and heroes to interview, and you can ask, would you want to name your church after one of them? Well, hello and welcome to Who Wants to Be a Saint? Today we look at 3 candidates who would all like to be considered as Christian saints or heroes. 2 of them come from a long time ago, from 2,000 years ago, and one of them is slightly more modern. She comes from 200 years ago, and there's a local connection here. But let's get on with the show and introduce all 3 candidates. First of all, candidate number 1, can you tell us what your name is, please?
I'm Paul.
And where do you come from, Paul?
Tarsus.
And what is your occupation?
I make tents.
Thank you very much. Candidate number 2, what is your name?
Peter.
And where do you come from, Peter?
Galilee.
And what's your occupation?
Bishop.
Thank you. And candidate number 3, what is your name?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth.
And where do you live, Elizabeth?
I live in London.
And what's your occupation?
I'm a mother.
Wonderful. Let's get on to the questions then. Our first question comes from a member of the audience. And the question is this. If a saint is a person who says yes to Jesus, let's go back to your early lives when you were young men and women. Did you say yes to Jesus? So first of all, candidate number 1, Paul, did you say yes to Jesus? That's a bit awkward. All right then. Let's move on to candidate number 2. Candidate number 2, Peter, did you say yes to Jesus? Oh, that's a relief.
Aren't you forgetting something?
Do you have to mention that?
I'm sorry, this does have to be a full investigation. Right, perhaps we better proceed to candidate number 3, hopefully. Elizabeth, did you say yes to Jesus? Oh, that's very good. I'm glad to hear it.
Would anyone like some chocolate?
Then why do I do?
Oh, thank you very much.
That's lovely chocolate. Where does it come from?
My cousin, Joseph Fry, he lives in Bristol. He's a chocolate maker.
You must have a lovely house too. How did you afford all of that?
Well, my family, of course. My father's a banker, and my husband's a merchant.
Merchant. What does he trade in? Or, more to the point, what has he traded in for the past 100 years?
Do we have to talk about that?
Oh dear, it sounds like this might be more complicated than it looked. I think we'd probably better look at the histories of all these candidates in a little bit more detail. Paul, Peter and Elizabeth. They weren't just chosen at random. Paul and Peter are in my old book of saints. They're in the Church of England calendar. Look at Paul. There are dozens of statues of him all over the world. There's St. Paul's Cathedral, not just in London, there's one in Calcutta as well. Nearer to home, there are several St. Paul's churches, there's a road, even a carnival named after St. Paul. As for Peter, the most famous church in the world may be St. Peter's in Rome. And there are lots of local links too. Peter and Paul are often seen together. They have the same feast day, the 29th of June. And these two churches, Bath Abbey and Clifton Cathedral, are both named after both Peter and Paul. As for Elizabeth, she's Elizabeth Fry. Her picture was on the old £5 note, and her husband's family crest, with the 3 horses on it, appears in buildings in this part of the world. They seemed a good choice. So what went wrong? Let's start with Paul. If you remember, the problem was that when we asked whether he'd said yes to Jesus, he said no. To understand what happened, we'll have to look in the Bible. The story of St. Paul is found in the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles. If you go to the New Testament, the first 4 books of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Luke continues the story in the book of Acts. If you want to press pause, if you've got a Bible, you can go and fetch it and follow the story yourselves. So the story of St. Paul begins at Acts chapter 7, verse 58. It's a sad story. It's the story of the murder of St. Stephen, who told people about Jesus, but the people were enraged and they ground their teeth against him and killed him. And the book of Acts says that the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now I've got to stop here because there's some confusion. Both Peter and Paul are called by 2 different names in the Bible. They're Peter and Paul, and they're Simon and Saul. The confusion comes because people in those days often had Greek names and Hebrew names, and the 2 of them are both used in the Bible. So in this story, Paul is called Saul. The witnesses laid their cloaks down at the feet of a man called Saul, and Saul was consenting to the death of Stephen. A little bit later on in the book, Saul was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, and he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any of the followers of Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem, breathing threats and murder. That's the story of Paul. What kind of man was this? In the game show, we gave him a blank face. What do you think his face would actually look like? I'm going to suggest that you press pause now and try to draw the face of Paul. This is a serious task. What would the face look like of somebody who's persecuting Christians, someone who's doing evil to the saints? What would the face of evil look like? Stop and think about it. Cartoonists have tried to draw the faces of villains and wicked people. Have a look here at Captain Hook. You can see they've given him an enormous jaw and nose. He's got menacing black eyebrows, bulging eyes, and I'm afraid his deformity, the hook, is used to make him even more frightening. Now, compare the faces of two imaginary heroines. See them? They've got perfect beauty. The face shape is almost identical. They've got lovely wide eyes. The eyes are actually way too big for their faces. You know that these two girls are determined to do good. But is it that simple? Let's go back to Frozen. Here is the villain, Hans. Now he's got a normal name. There are no bushy eyebrows. Nice friendly smile. It's not quite so straightforward. Can real villains look pleasant too? Look at these four. You would think that they were happy family men. If you've studied history, you may recognize them. They're four major war criminals of World War II. The one on the right is Hitler. Some people say you can tell a person's character from looking at their eyes. So here's a test. 12 pairs of eyes. Which of these would you trust? There are a couple of murderers here, and one person who's considered a modern-day saint. Why don't you press pause again and try to decide what you think of them? Do their eyes give you a hint of their character? If you're interested, here are the names. Do any of them surprise you? What's the conclusion then? It's hard to know what to draw on the face of Paul. In fact, I looked and I couldn't find any artist who tried to illustrate the scene of Paul breathing threats and murder. And it may be that all the artists knew something. They knew what happened next. What happened next took place here, on the road to Damascus. I'll read you the story, but you can find it yourselves too. It's in the book of Acts again, chapter 9. Now as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were travelling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now the people who'd found Saul were frightened. They said, I've heard much about this man, how much evil he has done to the saints at Jerusalem. But God said to them, Go, he's a chosen instrument of mine, to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. So they looked after Saul, and eventually the scales fell from his eyes and he regained his sight. He rose and he was baptized and took food and was strengthened. And for several days he stayed with the disciples at Damascus. And then he went into the synagogue and proclaimed Jesus, saying, He is the Son of God. Saul turned his life around. God turned evil to good. And the rest of Saul, or Paul's life, was spent travelling around, preaching, teaching, spreading the news of Jesus. If you go on in the New Testament, you'll find the letters he wrote, the letters to the churches in Corinth and Galatia and Ephesus. But first, he had some problems to face. And the first was how to get out of Damascus. The people who had travelled with him all wanted to kill him now. So his new Christian friends had to let him over the walls secretly in a basket. Now there are many, many more stories about Paul. The Acts of Apostles is a fascinating book which is full of thrilling stories. Paul was imprisoned, he escaped, and he finally ended up in Rome after a harrowing journey by ship. You can read about it in Acts 27 to 28. There was a storm. Paul had warned the captain not to travel, but he did. The ship was wrecked off the coast of Malta, but every life was saved. And the people dragged themselves from the shipwreck onto the shore and were sitting by the fire trying to warm themselves. A viper came out of the fire and fastened itself around the hands of Paul. He's surely got to be doomed, they all thought. He must be a murderer to have this thing happen to him. But no, God still needed him. And so he was saved from the storm, from the shipwreck, from the viper, from prison. He lived a life of adventure, but it was a life serving God. He might have said no at first, but the rest of his life was lived in saying an enormous yes. So let's go on to number 2, Peter. When we asked the question, he said yes to Jesus. That's true. And this picture shows the scene. Jesus found Peter and his brother Andrew fishing. He called them. He said he'd make them fishers of men. And they followed him. They were his first disciples. Peter was always the enthusiastic one. Whatever Jesus suggested, Peter wanted to do more. And towards the end, he told Jesus, even if everyone else falls away, I will never deny you. But if you remember from our game show, Paul showed Peter that sign of the rooster crowing, and it upset Peter. Why did that happen? Well, you see, when Peter told Jesus he would never deny him, Jesus said, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. The story is found in more than one place in the Bible. Here's the scene. You can see it in the picture. Jesus is upstairs. He's being questioned. Peter is downstairs. He's the man with white hair in the middle. You can just see the halo, even in this scene. And if we read in the Bible, we'll see what happened next. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a maid came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But Peter denied it before them all, saying, I don't know what you mean. And when he went out to the porch, another maid saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know this man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Jesus, certainly you're one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I don't know the man. And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the cock crows you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter realized what he had done immediately. What happened next? You know that Jesus was crucified and Jesus rose from the dead. And when he did, he spoke to Peter. He met him and he asked him, do you love me? He asked 3 times. 3 times to replace the 3 times that Peter had said no. And 3 times Peter said, yes, I do love you. What's our verdict about Peter? In a moment of fear, he was human and he protected himself. But in the end he said yes, and he spent the rest of his life acting on that yes. You may remember from the last time we spoke that Jesus took Peter, used him to start the whole Christian church. Can we accept someone who's not perfect? Someone who's had flaws in his life? Can we call this person a hero? Jesus did. Now finally we turn to Elizabeth, and she was Elizabeth Fry. She was born in 1780, and her husband's cousins in Bristol started up Fry's Chocolate. The picture on the £5 note shows what she did. A friend took her to visit Newgate Prison in London, and Elizabeth was shocked by the condition of the women prisoners there and their children who were also being kept in the prison. She started to work to make life better for them, so that when they came out of prison, they would stay out. She read to them, she gave them good advice, and she made a real difference in people's views about how to treat prisoners. Elizabeth Fry also started up night shelters for people who were homeless. Some of the problems we have now were there 200 years ago as well. All the time she was also raising her 11 children. She led what anyone would consider a good life. She dedicated herself to Jesus when she was 18 years old. So what was the question asked about her family? Well, back in the 1600s and the early 1700s, many people who became wealthy merchants and bankers got some of their money through things that were connected with slavery. They had ships that traded with the Caribbean islands, or they bought and sold products that came from there, and many of the workers on those islands were enslaved people. There seems to be some evidence that the Fry family also benefited from the slave trade. But there's a bit of a difference here. The Frys were Quakers, And the Quakers realised long before most other people how terrible the slave trade was. And they gathered together and fought against it. And Elizabeth was one of a long line of people who spoke out against the evils of slavery. She was part of the work that led to this famous picture that was used by those fighting against slavery to abolish the slave trade. So Elizabeth's family had become rich through slavery, but then they turned around and fought against it, and Elizabeth herself was part of that. So what's our answer about Elizabeth? Can we forgive her family's past and recognise her as a Christian hero? Would we hold against her something that her family did more than 100 years ago? Or should we look at her life? The Church of England has recognised her in their calendar of saints and heroes. The wonder of these stories, the stories of Paul, Peter and Elizabeth, is that God has taken people who were quite ordinary and turned their lives around. You might not recognise them to look at them. Their faces might look like anyone else. They're people like us. God has called, and in their own way, they've said yes. And perhaps in their lives, we've seen something that reflects the wonder of God. If they're people like us, then God may be calling us too. So keep watching. The list of Christian saints and heroes will grow. Perhaps someday people that we know may appear on that list, because God calls all of us. He's calling us today, and we can all say yes.